thank you very much for being here with us today, James. So a lot of what we think we know about World War II is based more on perceptions and myths than on actual facts. It's such a popular topic, so why aren't there more updates to popular knowledge about World War II?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the challenges is, I mean, there's a lot of amazing work in academic circles, but I mean, as you all know, academic writing and popular narrative writing are two very different disciplines. I mean, they both require a huge amount of research and scholarship, but it's just a different writing style. And I think, it's slowly but surely this kind of sort of, there's been quite a revolution in how we think about the Second World War in the last sort of 10, 15 years, I suppose. And a lot of good academic work. And I think that's slowly but surely sort of creeping into the mainstream. The real problem is that for most people, their knowledge of the Second World War comes from movies and TV series and documentaries. Most documentaries even aren't terribly good. They're kind of sort of rushed and sort of a bit Wikipedia based. And so they tend to kind of sort of perpetuate those myths a bit. But I think it is changing.
Oh, that's always good news.
Yes.
You have said before in previous books that you have noticed a lot of details that make you want to go deeper in research about World War II during the process of writing a novel, not a historical essay. So how do you think it's possible that so many details have been overlooked by previous research?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that research is just getting easier. I mean, obviously not during the time of COVID, but up to COVID and hopefully soon again. Travel is cheaper, it's easier. You can go to archives now and you can photograph, in an hour what used to take a week. I mean, I remember when I was first researching, I remember I was annotating a British submarine's logbook, and it took all week. Well, now I just, that took half an hour to photograph that, and I'd photograph the whole lot, and you can then digest it back at home at your leisure, which means you can access and process much more primary research than you could in the past, I think. And I think that combination of cheaper travel and easier archival access means that, a few more stones are being unturned now.
And do you think all this talk about technology making things easier, and especially World War II coming through in movies and video games, I'm thinking especially of a younger population, do you think there's interest, renewing interest in World War II, maybe through those channels that sometimes don't depict it as accurately as they could?
Yeah, I do, but my point would be, isn't it fantastic that it's still at the forefront? There's so many movies about to come out. There's Operation Mincemeat, there's SAS Rogue Warriors, there's a book about appeasement, film about appeasement just about to come out. There's a planned mini-series about the Second World War by Ridley Scott, and so it goes on and on and on. I mean, it's just absolutely endless. And, when you talk to commissioners for TV productions, they also go, well, we're worried that Second World War's had its day, and, but yet still more comes out. And obviously the video games are incredible. I mean, Call of Duty is the biggest video game in the world. 120 million people play this game every single day. The latest one, Vanguard, is Second World War. Of the different editions, I think over half of them have been World War II. And, although the vast majority are just going to be playing it and just seeing it as a video game, it's going to spark interest in a percentage, and you hope that they will then sort of go on and want to learn a little bit more. I mean, it's really interesting. I did a Netflix series, a couple of Netflix series over the last few years, and their average audience is 15 to 35. And I do a weekly podcast on the Second World War, and the biggest age group is 35 to 38, and the average age is 42. Whereas, kind of 10 years ago, I was sort of wondering whether, as the generations got older, that would be the end of it. But it doesn't seem to be, and, that's terrific. And I suppose it's because the Second World War is just such an incredible period of human drama. For all those competent nations, the major competent nations, it affected every man, woman, and child in a way that the vast majority of wars just haven't. I mean, I can't think of, in the case of Britain's experience, or Germany's, for example, or France. I mean, or even Italy. You can't think of another conflict that has affected the lives of all those people in those countries in such a complete and total way.
That is very true. That that makes me think of another question about the impact of the war, because I think you talk in another one of your books, in Normandy, about how there is this perception that World War I was, perhaps because it was more manual, say, that it had a greater loss of life, that it was more terrible, and whereas World War II was a safer war, so to speak, whereas when you had to advance and defend positions in World War II, the machinery was so much more advanced that it was just as much of a slaughter as World War I. So if you could develop that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about the Eastern Front, we were talking about Germany, we were talking about Japanese, Second World War was considerably worse than any previous conflict that's come that way. I suppose it's sort of, in the case of Britain and France's experience, Britain, I suppose, particularly, best part of them, sort of 1 million people killed in the First World War in Britain alone, whereas less than half of that were killed in the Second World War. I suppose the point I've been trying to make is that don't confuse that with it being safer. It's just that by the Second World War, they're organising themselves in a slightly different way. So, by the time of Normandy, for example, the British Army is 43% is service troops out of your army. And actually only 14% is infantry, and only 8% are in armoured units. And of that 8%, only 48% are actually in tanks. My point has been that for those who are actually at the coal face of war, those who are actually doing the fighting, it was more dangerous than it was in 1914 to 1918. So although you're throwing fewer men into the firing line, those who are in the firing line are facing a more dangerous time. And statistically, if you were in the infantry in the Second World War or in a tank, your chances of getting through unscathed was 0.
Wow. That is a very low percentage.
Yeah.
So Operation Husky, as you state in your book, was the most important amphibious operation of its time, and it even mobilized more men than D-Day. However, it isn't nearly as famous as Normandy, so what do you think that is?
Well, I suppose it's because of the events that followed, the sort of invasion of southern Italy and then the fall of Rome on the 4th of June 1944, followed by D-Day, and all these huge events. And then, of course, at the end of the war, you have all this sort of realization of what's been going on in the death camps and these, the appalling Holocaust that's going on. Those events are sort of being revealed at that time. And I suppose, that has just sort of superseded a campaign that seems quite remote in a way, sort of in the Mediterranean. But actually, the Sicily Campaign is a terrific story. I mean, it's got naval battles and aerial battles and battles on land. It's got special forces. It's got paratroopers and airborne troops and gliders. It's got the SAS. It's got the Mafia. It's got Mussolini being overthrown. It's got Tiger tanks. It's got mountains. It's got plains. It's got and it's an island, so it's a very self-contained story with a clear start, middle, and end. And lots of thrilling drama. So from a purely dramatic point of view, Sicily is a really, really terrific story. And I think actually it is a really important moment in the war because, I've argued before that Germany got itself into a position where it couldn't really win much earlier than 1943. But certainly by the middle of 1943, it's game up effectively. And I know it takes the best part of another 2 years before they're completely defeated, but the writing is on the wall, the fight back is on, it's only going to go one way. And so it is this momentous moment, particularly in the summer where you've got the defeat of the U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic in May 1943. Then you've got the Germans attacking at Kursk in the Eastern Front and being kicked back. And that's the last time the Germans go forward. Then you've got this huge invasion in Sicily and the Allies, Western Allies, getting that toehold into Europe. With all the lessons learned and Mussolini being overthrown, I think it is a really, really key moment because, of course, one of the biggest aims of the Sicilian campaign is that Italy should be knocked out of the war, that it would hasten Italy's exit from the war, and that happens. And, that has enormous knock-on effects because Italian troops are garrisoning obviously not only Italy, but all the Balkans and all the Aegean, Greece, and all those Greek islands and so on. And either the Germans, when the Italians are out of the war, the Germans either have to replace those troops or they have to retreat. And neither option is a good one. And obviously they choose to replace those troops at enormous cost to their own war resources.
So, despite this lack of popular recognition, you have devoted a whole monograph to the invasion of Sicily, which is something that hadn't been done practically since the 80s, I think. So, what attracted you the most about Sicily to prompt you to write this book?
Well, I've been there a number of times. I actually wrote a novel set in Sicily during the war some years ago. But I'd also been there a few times with the British Army. They do these sort of battlefield studies where they're sort of, it's partly sociable, but it's also kind of learning the lessons from the past and how that can help their understanding of current conflict. And I realised just what an incredible story it was. But I also realised that the main narrative, the biggest narrative history that came out was by 𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗘𝗦 este back in the late 1980s. So it's a long time ago. And I just have a different take from 𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗘𝗦 on the war as a whole, but specifically with the Sicilian Campaign. And so I just thought it was ripe for a kind of, reappraisal and looking at it afresh. And of course, all that stuff I was saying earlier on about kind of ease of access and to documents and all the rest of it, that affects one's understanding of the Sicilian Campaign as much as any other part of the Second World War.
Definitely. Well, it's always good also to have this update on popular knowledge and history for people that is not just academic. So it is a great book.
I mean, obviously, I always kind of think I'm right, but history is to a certain extent subjective. Well, it's subjective. One wants to be objective, but obviously you're coming at it from a particular angle, and what we choose to put in and leave out is obviously a subjective issue. So, I think all these subjects, particularly subjects of the Second World War, which are so nuanced and complicated and have so many levels to them and layers to them. I think there's always scope for different appreciations of what happened.
No, definitely. And you've mentioned before that Sicily was the invasion of Sicily was meant to be this toehold for the Allies back into Europe. And I wanted to ask you whether Sicily was the only option that they thought of, or whether, for example, Spain, which was a neutral country, would have been an option. Because I think like Operation Mincemeat also was related a bit to that. So if you could tell us a bit what you think about that.
Yeah, there were various options. You could have the Allies could have gone into Greece. They could have gone into Sardinia. Yes, they could have gone into Spain, but none of those options were really viable, I don't think. One of the key issues is that you need air cover, and you need fighter planes to be able to shoot down enemy planes, whether they be bombers or fighters. And so you need to be within range of those fighters. And obviously fighters are smaller, so therefore their fuel tanks are smaller than bombers, so therefore their range is smaller. So it really needs to be within that range. So that rules out Greece completely. It makes Sardinia problematic. It's not entirely impossible, but why would you go into Sardinia when you could have complete air cover over Sicily? Because you've got the tiny island of Malta, which is basically kind of absolutely bursting with fighter planes, and western Sicily is just 60 miles south of Sicily. And then you've got northern Tunisia, which is only 100 miles or so from the kind of western side of Sicily. So it's so obvious. And also the narrowness of the Messina Straits, the link to southern Italy, should you want to develop it further, it's just the obvious place to go, really. And Sicily itself has a lot of airfields. So again, once you take a Sicily, you then gain those airfields from which you can then further your attacks on Italy and access lines of communication and so on. So whichever way you look, Sicily makes the most obvious one. I think invading Spain would have been incredibly problematic because Spain is neutral, and it's not the Allies' business to go and invading neutral countries. The whole point is that they're on a kind of sort of moral crusade, and whether some of that sort of the morality of that moral crusade is sort of starting to get a bit murky by 1943, that's a different discussion. But you can't go into a neutral country, and of course, whether Franco had rolled over or not, maybe diplomatically, the full weight of Britain and America could have persuaded Franco, but he's a dictator after all, and Britain and America, they're fighting for democracy, so what are they going to do? That's going to mean the overthrow of Franco, so you're going to have to then deal with Franco's army, and you're going to have to fight that. It's just impossible. So I think Sicily was really the only option. The thing about Operation Mincemeat is it's the most this idea that this operation in which a kind of a drunk down and out from Wales was made up to look like a British commando officer carrying kind of key documents who'd been drowned at sea. It's a fantastic story. I mean, it's full of sort of twists and turns, and it's the most improbable thing. And the fact that the Spanish picked him up, passed on the information to the Germans, and it actually reached Hitler, means that the whole thing was a complete success. But, it's always painted as the operation that turned the tide of the war and all this kind of stuff. And that's just nonsense. I mean, it made no effect whatsoever, because Hitler already assumed that the Allies were going to go into Greece, completely erroneously, and Hitler tended to view his enemy through the same prism that he viewed himself. So in other words, for him, the most important part of the Mediterranean was the Ploesti airfields in southern Romania. So for him, that would be the number one target for the Allies. And so therefore, they're going to go to the nearest place they can get to, which is sort of going into Greece and then up the Balkans. He doesn't understand that you need air power and air cover and all these kind of things. So nobody else thinks it's going to be anything other than Sicily, because Sicily is just so darned obvious that that's the place they're going to be. So the interesting thing about Operation Mincemeat is it confirms what Hitler already believes, and it doesn't dissuade anyone who thinks it's going to be in Sicily.
Well, that is also quite interesting, because we always have, going again into those myths about World War II, we always have that image of Hitler as a military genius that was basically taking over Europe and we couldn't do anything about it. But once you see, especially how the German command worked during the Sicilian invasion, you realize that it wasn't quite like that.
No, it certainly wasn't. I mean, one has to remember that Hitler in the First World War his military experiences of the front line is as a very, very, very junior non-commissioned officer. He's never been to staff college. He's never done any further training. He's never done any officer training. He's made himself Commander-in-Chief of the German Army in December 1943, as well as being the Commander-in-Chief of all our armed forces. And okay, so he's read lots of history books, but so have I. But that doesn't mean I'd be a good field marshal or Commander-in-Chief of the military. I wouldn't have a clue. So the problem is in the 1930s, the cult of the Führer becomes increasingly strong, and he starts to believe in his own myth. And he's surrounded by sycophants and people who tell him what he wants to hear. And so you start to believe it. And the fall of France is not his idea at all, the tactics for the French invasion. They're largely Guderian's. And he takes full credit for that. Everyone thinks he's a military genius, and they will pay the price for it in the following 5 years.
Yeah, definitely. And so, talking about leadership of armies during the invasion of Sicily, in the Allied side, there are obviously some very, very big personalities, such as Patton and Montgomery. And I wanted to ask you about their relationship, because they are famous for how they clashed, at least in the traditional narrative. And I wanted you to tell us a bit more about that relationship that they had, and what were they like? Because, for example, I know that the Allies had this policy of steel, not flesh, about trying to minimize their damage in soldiers, in men. But it seems that Patton was so obsessed always with getting there first that he was willing to sacrifice more men, or is it maybe that's only my impression?
No, I think that's fair, actually. I mean, both have really monstrous egos. Both are very prickly. They're very difficult, but they're actually quite different characters. Montgomery's very much sort of, I'm right and I'm not interested in hearing any kind of alternative view. Patton is more kind of more thundery. He's more up and down. I think Montgomery is a much more sort of consistent, kind of level-headed fellow. Patton gets worked up. He gets in sort of rages and then sort of calms down again. He's much more sort of mercurial, I suppose. But yeah, but Montgomery is also competitive and wants to be first and wants to be top dog. But with Patton, it's almost kind of sort of pathological. He has to be number one. He has to be the greatest general, the best, everything. And then after that, he wants his army to do the best, and then he wants America to do the best, in that order. And that competitiveness sort of drives a certain sense of Anglophobia, I suppose. We're not going to be pushed around by the limeys, all that kind of stuff. But actually, credit where credit's due, Patton always obeys orders. So if, you might tell him to do something that he doesn't want to do, and he'll, fire and brimstone in his diary, but he'll still do it. Whereas Montgomery's much more kind of, I'll just do what I want. It is interesting, though. I think the competitiveness is driven really by Patton in the case of Sicily, the race for Messina. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest at all that Montgomery sees it in those terms. To start off with, Eighth Army is the senior partner because it's more experienced and it's given the main role in the assault on Sicily. And that's completely understandable because the Americans are not untested to a large extent. They've never fielded more than a corps, which is just a handful of divisions, division being about sort of 15,000, 16,000 men. They've never put an army in the field before until Sicily. So, they need to kind of prove themselves and show that they can operate at army level. And they do very successfully in Sicily. And the moment they do that and prove how good they are, then Alexander, who is the overall commander, and Montgomery go, great, can you come and help us here in the northeast of Sicily? And they're absolutely delighted to have the Americans. So there's no kind of sort of issue about it. It's come from the movie, hasn't it? It's come from Patton. It's come from not very good biographies of Patton. And I think there is also, I think there is a sort of streak of mild Anglophobia in a lot of American historians. Because, of course, when they were at school, they were brought up on the Thin Red Line and Lexington and Bunker Hill and Britain being the enemy in the kind of Revolutionary War and War of 1812 and so on. And I think that just sort of slightly informs it. It's a bit like sort of, British with the French, there's history there. And so I think British, American historians in the Second World War, they like to kind of there's a sort of temptation to sort of slightly get one over the British. And I think also that it's also informed by what happened post-war, where obviously there was a massive decline in Britain, end of Britain's empire, decline of Britain as a great power, whilst at the same time America is emerging as the number one world superpower. So for a lot of people, it's very hard to kind of think of Britain, this tiny little Britain today, being this sort of global superpower that it was in the 1940s. And I think all of that informs that kind of slightly misappreciation of reality, and certainly the case in Sicily. But both Patton and Montgomery are just, they're fantastic characters. They're really, really interesting. I think both of them were incredibly competent, brilliant commanders, but obviously both deeply flawed as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're so interesting.
Exactly. You give a very nuanced portrayal, I think, because you quote extensively their diaries as well, which gives a different view of that, the one perhaps that they wanted to portray. So that is really great.
I think Montgomery is incredibly conscious all the time of the lives of his men. He's experienced the First World War, and I know Patton has too. Patton saw action on the Western Front in 1917, 1918. But Montgomery kind of really lived through the whole thing, and I think it was a different experience for the British, who lost 900,000 men dead in the First World War to the United States. And they're also conscious that Britain has been at war since 1939 and is fighting literally every corner of the globe. And there are pools of manpower. It's getting stretched in a way that the United States isn't. The United States has kind of in 1944 200 million people in the country. Britain has 44 million. So the manpower resources of Britain are much less than the USA, and politically, it is not acceptable to have a wholesale slaughter, and politically, Britain is going to run out of manpower if they're not careful. So that is also informing Montgomery's actions, and he understands very well that his armies are predominantly conscript, people who don't really want to be there, who are doing it because they've got to, and that they need very, very careful marshalling. Whereas Patton is absolutely, he is a war man. He thrives in war. He sees it absolutely as his destiny to be, a great commander, and he definitely pushes his men a little bit harder. But consequently, the casualties in his armies are greater than almost anyone else's.
Yeah, makes sense. So obviously Sicily happened the year prior to Normandy, and I want to ask you whether you think that, and also many of the commanders that took part in the invasion of Sicily, also then took part in the organization of Normandy. So could we see the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, as a sort of rehearsal for the landing in Normandy, or what would be their relationship, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, don't forget that it is an absolutely confirmed, put in the diary, kind of that this cannot budge, that the Normandy invasion will be in 1944. There's absolutely, that is not to be budged. That will happen. So of course they already know that when they're planning for Husky. So of course they've got a kind of sort of a mind to what's to follow. And an invasion of this scale is just so complex. It's just so enormous. You think of all the men that have got to be in individual landing craft. The landing craft got to be attached to individual ships. You're dealing with navies, air forces, armies, different nationalities, British, Canadians, Americans. There's an awful lot to pull together. Different planning teams in different parts of the world. Some in Algiers, some in Cairo. Some in Tunis, some in Malta. It's an incredibly complex operation. And yeah, absolutely. Lots of lessons to be learned, to be noted, and not a dress rehearsal exactly, and not even a rehearsal for Normandy, but certainly, it's a good thing to be able to have this under your belt before you tackle Normandy.
I suppose also that this massively complex organization was also a bit what caused what we can see now in retrospect, at least, this sort of like disjointment or uncoordination between all these different forces, because despite the final success of the whole operation, it seemed, at least while reading your book, that all these three countries that were coming together, and both the land, air, and marine forces, that they were not working in unison perhaps as they should. So there was a lot of mistakes that also were made.
Well, I think it's more a case of the Western Allies kind of trying to work out what is their way of war. 3 years earlier, neither America nor Britain would have expected to be in this situation. The whole point was that Britain had an alliance with France. They were going to, France had the huge army, Britain had the huge navy. Britain was going to do naval power and burgeoning air power, and France was predominantly going to be doing the land power bit. And what they were going to do is they were going to build up a huge amount of strength, wait for the Germans to attack, knock it back, then counterattack and win the war. That obviously went completely pear-shaped in 1940 because France was overrun, and the British had to retreat from Dunkirk. France's huge army was defeated, and an armistice was signed. So suddenly Britain's got to kind of find an army because America's not in the war at that point. So it's got to recreate a much larger army and equip it with modern technology and equipment and weaponry that is going to be able to combat the Germans. So you've got to do that, and you've got to grow your air power and your bomber, and you've got to work out what bombing is and how you do it, because air power is still incredibly new in the 1940s. It's less than 40 years old, yeah. And only in the kind of first years of the 20th century were people kind of actually getting airborne, and that was with kind of sort of canvas and wood and glue and string. And now you've got fully stressed metal kind of 4-engine bombers. It's like a huge. The growth is just so huge. And from America's point of view, it has tiny armed forces. It was absolutely part of its policy in between the wars to have very, very small armed forces, with the exception of a navy. So rather like Britain, has a tiny air corps at the time, not even an air force. The army is absolutely tiny, and suddenly they've got to grow as well. So not only are they growing their armed forces, they're also having to work out how they use these armed forces and what they need. And really, it's remarkable that by 1943, they've both got such vast armed forces, air power, naval power, and armies, and that they're starting to work out what their methodology is and how you coordinate naval, air, and land power together and make it work together. And that there's different forms of air power. There's strategic air power, which is, air forces operating on their own, heavy bombers and so on. And then there's tactical air power, which is really new. This is only kind of, this is what the Luftwaffe grew up with in the 1930s, but it's new to the Western Allies. And that's close air support, that's supporting ground troops. And this is all new, and it's sort of coming together at the end of the Tunisia campaign, but it really comes together for the first time in Sicily, which is, for me, one of the reasons why it makes it so incredibly interesting.
Oh, it is absolutely. And I was thinking something that is also very interesting and very spectacular is the growth of the U.S. Army.
Yes.
Because we always have this, through Hollywood, mainly these movies about the exploits of the American Army, and you think them as some super powerful force at the time. But in your book, you see how they grow from nothing to 100 in just a few years. And it's still interesting to see how in Sicily they're still almost finding their balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you're right. I think most people just assume that the American army just arrived fully formed on, the day after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. But it wasn't. At the start of the war, it was only 189,000 strong, which puts it between sort of Uruguay and Portugal in terms of size, which is obviously very, very small. They're still wearing old-fashioned kind of British Brodie helmets and sort of leggings, and they just look like from a different era. And then suddenly, by kind of 1942, they've got the kind of familiar helmets that we all know. They've got the kind of modern jackets. I mean, their jackets are based on a pre-war civilian wind cheater, and that's an acknowledgement that this new army, which is millions strong, which has been raised from nothing, is largely civilian. And so you want clothes that civilians are going to feel comfortable in and that are practical. It's not about looking martial. It's not militaristic. If you compare that to the German look, which is, super militaristic, because they're a militaristic state, whereas America, and to a certain extent Britain, they're warfare states, but they're not militaristic states. And so, the uniforms that they have reflect that. And it's extraordinary to think that, by 1943, already the US Army is sort of several million strong compared to kind of, 180,000 it was in 1939.
It is rather incredible. So I think what we have been talking about the US, the British Army, and the Germans. We haven't spoken yet about the Italians. And it's always interesting that they are usually portrayed in the narrative as some very badly prepared troops, ill-fitted, ill-equipped, undisciplined as well. So there's this very negative image. And it's interesting because it seems as if the Allies, they thought that they were going to meet very tough opposition when they got to Sicily, and it wasn't really the case at all. So what do you think about that, and why do you think that Italy was so ill-prepared?
Yeah, I don't think much of that assessment of Italians is unfair, actually. I mean, the truth is Italy is impoverished, really, in 1939, and the fact that Italy gets drawn into war is entirely opportunistic. I mean, Mussolini obviously has a massive ego too, and he has grandiose ideas for a kind of a new Roman Empire, which is going to sort of dominate the Mediterranean. Italy's going to be the numero uno power. It's going to stretch across the Balkans and Greece and the Aegean. It's going to stretch down to Egypt and Sudan and Libya and all the way into East Africa. And it's going to be this huge empire, of which Rome is going to be the center. It's going to be the kind of the capital. Even Mussolini knows that his forces are not good enough to be able to compete with kind of Britain and France and Germany, or even the United States, should it come to it. But that was never his intention. I mean, when he declares war on the 10th of June 1940, it's because he thinks that not only is France beaten, but so is Britain. He is just, his geopolitical understanding is not what it needs to be, and he's misjudged it. He's made a catastrophic call. And as if there was any doubt about that, he then goes and invades Greece in the end of October 1940 and gets a bloody nose. They then go and sort of reluctantly, his generals march into Egypt, and they're absolutely slaughtered by a British force which is, a sixth of the size. 133,000 Italian troops are rounded up just like that. I mean, two entire armies are completely destroyed, by February 1941. And it's incredibly humiliating for him, and he's just misjudged it. And the truth is, his complacency has got in the way. The armed forces are they're old hat in terms of the way they're thinking. Their officer classes are poorly trained. They're old-fashioned in their outlook. The army is incredibly infantry-based, and that's not the way of modern wars. The Navy is the most modern bit, but it hasn't got any radar or anything on its ships, and radio network is poor, and it doesn't have any aircraft carriers. And aircraft carriers are they're the most important capital ship in the Second World War, not battleships. Its air force is similarly behind the time, although has some very great aviators within it and some brilliant minds and designers and all the rest of it. And so they're just, they're a third division player competing in the Premier League, and they're just not good enough. However, after long months and years of fighting in North Africa alongside the Germans, who bring a certain level of professionalism and modernity to the whole thing, obviously there are going to be a number of men who kind of survive and who benefit from that experience. And so by the end of the Tunisia campaign, in the latter months of sort of the spring of 1943, you find there's some very, very good Italian units who are dogged, determined, who know what they're about, who know how to read the land and know how to defend effectively. And don't forget, defending is much easier than attacking, because you can stay hidden, while when you're attacking, you actually have to expose yourself and get out of your places of hiding. And so that doesn't persuade the Allies that the Italians are any good, but it just makes them think, well, hang on a minute, if Italian defences are getting better the closer we're getting to Italy and Sicily, i.e. northern Tunisia, then we just need to kind of take a step back here and just be careful, because we don't, the one thing that cannot happen if you launch an operation of the magnitude of Operation Husky is that it fails. You've got to go into that knowing that odds on you're going to pull it off, however big an undertaking it is. So that's why there's this level of caution. But the truth of the matter is that North Africa is really the last throw of the Italian armed forces, and years of corruption, ineptitude, underfunding, lack of resources. Just put this in examples. So the governmental sort of secretariat, which is the sort of main form of government, they meet every day in Rome from 9 until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And in 1940 they go, now we're at war, do you think we should maybe kind of, stay a little bit longer? And so they go, well, yeah, maybe. So they stay till 4 o'clock. And at the end of July 1940 they go, should we just get back to 2 o'clock? And they do, while every other major combatant is kind of sort of working round the clock. And that's just symptomatic of this sort of inertia, ineptitude, lack of thought, kind of just sort of out of the times. And so it's no wonder that they're in dire straits. And the other thing is that I think in the case of Italy, there just had never been much stomach for war in the first place. I mean, everyone's sort of like, okay, fine, if it's a really easy victory and we can easily take Egypt and the whole of Africa and Greece, then fine. But the moment it starts getting sticky, everyone's enthusiasm wanes. And it doesn't matter, even if you're a dictator, if you're not carrying the people, and morale is low, it's very, very difficult to motivate people, and it's very difficult to keep going. So while there are plenty of extremely courageous Italians, they're just out of their depth fighting this modern war.
I suppose in a sense that not only the Italians, because you describe Sicily throughout your book as a very hostile scenario for the war. Is geographically, the geography definitely didn't help, especially as you say, if you were attacking rather than defending. And also it was infested with illnesses, with plagues such as like malaria and different illnesses that took down a lot of troops. But there was a different plague that also the Allies also found in Sicily, which was the mafia, the Sicilian Mafia. So what role did the mafia actually play? Was it key in the invasion of Sicily? And how did it relate to the Allies? Because it was a sort of para-government of the island?
Yes, the mafia is really interesting. I mean, a lot of people have tried to downplay the role of the mafia in the invasion of Sicily, but for me, it's they were absolutely involved. And this goes back to kind of sort of Allied caution. If you're going to launch something as huge as Operation Husky, you want to make sure that you've left no stone unturned. And that within Sicily, there is a whole network with tentacles that spread absolutely everywhere throughout the island, which is very anti-fascist and against Mussolini and could potentially help you. So obviously you're going to exploit that. Why wouldn't you? It's a bit like having kind of sort of, an agent of, resistance movement in a country. Of course you're going to support it and try and encourage it to work on your behalf. And we know for a fact that the US naval intelligence was coercing 𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗦, who was a Sicilian mafioso, who by the start of the war was in prison in New York State. But he still had his business empire running, and his man on the outside was a chap called Vito Genovese, who was another Italian-American, although not from Sicily. And the Office of Naval Intelligence used 𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗦 and his network to help with security in New York port and harbour facilities. And to me, it seems inconceivable that they wouldn't have got in touch with him to talk to him and open up dialogue with the mafia in Italy, because it's just so obvious. And in actual fact, there was a chap called Max Corvo who was who left Sicily when he was a child from Melili on the eastern coast, and he was working for the OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA. And Corvo was given carte blanche to create a kind of a little sort of agent cell for Italy and Sicily before the Sicily invasion. And he was advised by his superiors to make contact with the mafia. And he said, no, I can't possibly do that because they're corrupt and awful, and we mustn't do anything like that. And his superiors kind of sort of shrugged and said, okay, well, fine, whatever. What's really interesting is that when he finally does get to northern Tunisia to put his little agent cell and operation into being and get to Sicily, he misses his boat. So he's given misinformation about which boat he and his team should be on. When he then gets to Sicily, it's absolutely clear that no one is in the slightest bit interested in him or anything he's got to do, which to me points to the fact that they've already got this sewn up with the mafia. So they've kept him on board because he might be useful in Italy later on or later on elsewhere in the Mediterranean. But he's given scant resources, scant attention, and basically it's hindered at every single available turn. It's so interesting. And yet what we do know is that Don Carlo Vizzini, who is the senior mafia don in Sicily, absolutely was contacted, absolutely was met by Sherman tanks when the moment came and driven into Palermo, and that he re-emerged a week later as the mayor of El Alba and one of the key players in kind of helping the Americans to organise civil affairs and the Allied military government, and grew incredibly rich as a result of it. So to me, it's absolutely clear that the mafia was involved, but I don't think they needed to be. You can see why the Allies are kind of sort of making those contacts before the campaign, because anything that makes their life easier in Sicily is to be welcomed. But as it turned out, the Sicilian forces were so quick to lay down their arms that it wasn't necessary. And that had very, very unfortunate consequences, because, of course, the Sicilian Mafia had been very, very badly battered by Mussolini's regime. They were pretty much dormant by the start of the Second World War. But afterwards, from 1943 onwards, they were massively resurgent, and they've been resurgent ever since.
That's really interesting. So another of the most famous episodes, probably, of the Sicilian invasion is at the end of it, how thousands of German soldiers escaped to Italy through the Straits of Messina. And I wanted to ask whether there was any way in which the Allies could have stopped that, or why maybe weren't they interested in stopping it, and whether it changed anything for the development of the war after that?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the big black marks about the Sicilian campaign traditionally. I mean, I would completely refute that. I mean, the Sicilian Straits are about the easiest place to organise an evacuation from you could hope for. I mean, everything favours that evacuation. First of all, you've got a tapering point of the northeast part of the island by the Straits of Messina. And that's very handy as a defender, because what it means is, as you retreat back into that corner, so your defensive line across that tapering corner gets smaller and smaller. And as it gets smaller, you require less men to defend it, which means that more men can go back while you're still holding off the Allies. The other thing is that there was from 333 coastal guns and anti-aircraft guns on that very, very narrow area. And that's about as well defended a stretch of coastland as anywhere in the entire planet at that point. And what that means is it's just impossible for naval forces, Allied naval forces, to get into the Straits of Messina without being absolutely shafted. And it also makes it very, very difficult for bombers to get in low, because there's just too much anti-aircraft fire. It's just too dangerous. And also, most of the vessels that the Germans are using, and indeed the Italians are using to escape, are very, very small. So from that height, it's almost impossible to hit them. You know, you have to get in really, really low, and that is just, it's impossible with that amount of defences there. And then one looks at kind of, you know, evacuations during the Second World War, and nearly all of them are successful. From Dunkirk, famously, you know, 338,000 British and a handful of Frenchmen, you know, evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940. You know, whilst under fire, whilst under attack, they got away. You look at the British evacuation from Crete, I think it was something like, you know, 42,000 out of 46,000 got away. Even in Greece, and in Crete it was something like 29,000 out of 42,000 got away. So nearly, you know, and then you look at kind of Operation Hannibal, which is the evacuation of German people from what was East Prussia, you know, the Baltic around Königsberg and Danzig in the last months of the Second World War. You know, 2 million, you know, in sort of broken old ships, and with the Red Army completely dominating the airspace and battlefield and seas. And that tells you that evacuations are broadly pretty successful and very, very hard to stop. And the other thing is, of the 39,000+ German troops that escaped, only about 25,000 of them are actually fighting troops. So, you know, 15,000 are service troops, you know, support troops, whatever. 25,000 troops isn't even 2 divisions. And the truth is that the amount of equipment and men and material that escapes from Sicily is not remotely enough to make the slightest change to what happens subsequently in Italy. It's not a decisive number of men or equipment. 338,000 British and French troops evacuated Dunkirk, 39,000 Germans in Sicily. You know, so it's a massive difference. And, you know, to capture Sicily in 38 days is an extraordinary achievement. If anyone ever doubts that, I would just say, just go there, look at the terrain, and then say, is this an easy place over to which to fight? Is this an easy place in which to kind of take on, you know, admittedly inferior, but still very determined and well-equipped German troops? And you have to conclude that it was a remarkable feat.
That's it. The thing about going there and seeing for yourself is something that you actually did while writing your book. You went to Sicily to see where all these battles and all this conflict had happened, and you met a lot of people who were alive at the time of the invasion. So what stories did you get told, and which one surprised you the most, or which one did you take home with you, so to speak?
Well, I'm a big advocate of walking the ground. I think walking the ground is essential because you just understand how everything kind of sort of fits together when you're able to do that. I don't know, there were so many kind of personal stories that really touched me. I mean, it was fascinating to kind of, you know, get the views of Sicilians to it, you know, who broadly been, you know, might have been quite enthusiastic about the war at the start of the war, but then, you know, the next minute are kind of welcoming the Americans at Gela, for example. And there's a sort of pragmatism there, I suppose, about that, which is kind of, you know, there is a sort of innate mistrust of central authority, and, you know, it's your family first, then your local community, then your island, then Italy, and, you know, if there's a change of regime, well, you know, it's not going to affect you too much. And, you know, the Americans are arriving in Gela with their chocolate and Coca-Cola and all the rest of it. So they're sort of, you know, they quickly have their heads turned in favour of the Allies. And of course, there's all those connections with so many Italians emigrating to America at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. In terms of personal stories, there's just so many. You know, I suppose if there's one, you know, that really struck me, which I was a bit surprised about, was probably 𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗦, who's a Luftwaffe fighter commander, and he kept an incredible diary and wrote just so thoughtfully and movingly about his experiences. And my very first book that I wrote about the Second World War was about the Siege of Malta. And then it was the sort of beleaguered RAF on Malta and, you know, fighting these terrible conditions and shortages against an overwhelming enemy. And, you know, what was remarkable about 𝗥𝗘𝗗𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗘𝗦𝗦 account was exactly the same, but in reverse.
Yeah.
So it had been the Luftwaffe and the Reggio Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, that had dominated in the siege of Malta for so long. And now it was the RAF getting their revenge, and Steinhoff and his comrades were on the receiving end of it. But even though he was German, and even though he was fighting for an abhorrent regime, it's hard not to feel kind of sympathy for him and a little bit of empathy for his experiences and his suffering.
Yeah, that's great. So this whole idea of three different countries coming together and doing this massive effort to fight against this common enemy is recurrent throughout the book. And I was wondering whether you think that we could learn something in our current political climate about how this almost brotherhood of nations coming together, whether you think there's any lessons to be taken from the effort that took to invade Sicily?
Well, I do think the Allied coalition in the West was absolutely astonishing. It's a masterclass of cooperation, coordination, collaboration. you know, because you're talking about different cultures. You're not talking about an alliance, although they're called the Allies. They weren't allies at all. They were just coalition partners. And this idea of one common goal uniting them is absolutely fascinating. And I do worry a little bit at the moment that it seems incredibly fractious. You know, Britain leaving the EU is not helping, I don't think. You know, it's been difficult times politically in the United States. You know, the world seems to be at loggerheads on so many different things, whether it be, you know, the world's riches, whether it be in the environment, whether it be kind of sort of embryonic land grabs as well. You know, these are troubled times, and all I would say now is just that for anyone in the West, you know, one should feel inspired by what was achieved in the Second World War, because it was absolutely remarkable. Yeah. And it shows what can be done when people pull resources and pull together rather than splinter. Yeah,
that is absolutely true. So now to finish, I wanted to ask you whether you're working on anything else now, because it seems that there's so much being done on World War II. Is there anything else for us to discover?
Well, yeah, I've got lots of plans for many books, which range from the Pacific to the Far East, Southeast Asia. I think the next book, I've just had a book out in the UK, which follows one particular armoured unit from D-Day to the end of the war. But the next thing I'm going to be doing is West Wall, which is the last 8 months of the war in the West. So from the end of September 1944 all the way through the winter of 1944-45 and into spring and the final months of the Second World War. So I'm going to do that, but you know, I'd love to tackle Monte Cassino and you know, various other things in the future.
Yeah, there's still so much.
There's still
so much everywhere.
So much.
Well, thank you very much for everything.
Oh, thank you, Christina.